I started playing Dota in 2005, and I remember when Hand of Midas was added to the game over 20 years ago. And despite decades of people theorizing around this item, nobody has ever done a real look at its impact. Right now, about 1 in 4 games of Dota have a Midas, but I'm wondering, is that even a good idea? Generally, when people try to show that an item is good, they do one of two things. They either look at what pro players are doing, and if pro players do it, it must be good, or they look at item win rates, and a high number must be good. The problem with modeling after pros should be obvious, but it often isn't. You are not a pro player. You do not play in a perfectly coordinated team with superhuman reflexes. And there's also a lot of problems drawing conclusions from item win rates. First, the end of game stats, like those that you see on Dota Buff, only look at the end of game inventories. That means if a player sells their Midas, that game isn't included in the Midas stats. The second problem is that item win rates don't actually tell you how much an item helps you. What you really need to know is what was your win expectancy before you bought the item and what was your win expectancy after you bought the item. If an item has a 65% win expectancy, but it gets there by dropping from a 95% win expectancy, that's terrible. By buying Midas, you're choosing not to prepare for team fights, pushing, or ganking. That's opportunity cost. The question isn't whether Midas causes you to lose or win. The question is whether something else would help you win more. The fourth problem is that item win rates do not factor in if the item is good in a specific role, lane, or hero, or bad in a specific role, lane, or hero. The final major problem is that item win rates are calculated based on the number of games played with that item. So if an item is often used by a really popular hero, then the item's win rate will reflect that hero's individual success more than the item's actual impact in the games. What you would really want to do is a big experiment, where you take a player and have them buy an item. Then, after the game, you wipe their memory, restart the game from just before they bought that item, and then have them do something else instead. If you could do this thousands of times, then you would get to see if Midas was actually improving their outcomes compared to some alternatives. But unfortunately, time machines and neuralizers do not exist. But there is an incredibly annoying and time-consuming alternative. I downloaded 38,849 ranked all-pick replays. I analyzed how many games actually had Midas, not just at the end screen, but at any point in the game. Whenever a hero buys Midas, we can look at the state of their game just before they bought it, and then we can compare it against all of the games with similar game states at the same time where players did not buy Midas. This way, we are only comparing games where Midas was or was not purchased from similar starting conditions. With all of that together, we can see, at roughly any time in the game, whether the player was ahead or behind, whether their team was ahead or behind, from any lane and any role, how much more do players who buy Midas win or lose? Alright, so here's how this analysis worked. We took all 38,840 named games and categorized every player by their hero, their role, whether they're core or support, and their lane. Then we looked at every hero's net worth every 30 seconds of the game. If a player ever bought Midas, we then looked at the net worths in the game just before they bought it. Then we put all the games into buckets of similar conditions at the same time in the game and looked at the final win rate for those who bought Midas versus those who did not. We're about to go deep into the weeds on when Midas saw success and failure, but here's a loose overview for anybody who somehow made it this far without actually caring about details. Basically, don't buy Midas if your team is behind. It does not matter how well you are doing. If your team cannot support your weight and win for the next 20 minutes, don't buy Midas. For non-ogre players as support, Midas only clearly helps if your team is very far ahead when you buy it. Regardless of your role, if you're not very closely tracking what's happening in every lane, I would recommend not buying Midas. Mid players generally buy Midas from a slightly losing position. Buying Midas had no effect whatsoever. Buying it or buying something else didn't budge their win expectancy. So once a core is already in this negative position, buying Midas doesn't hurt more than buying the typical build. On average, offlane core players who buy Midas see a pretty severe drop in win rate. Ogre Magi supports who buy Midas saw a significant win rate increase, but other supports see a staggering 6.6% drop in expected win rate. The typical mid buys Midas a little bit faster than other cores, but offlane and safe lane timings look almost identical. Mids buy Midas more than any other group, followed by safe lane and offlane supports. It takes 14 casts for Hand of Midas to pay back its own purchase cost. Without Ogre Magi, 1 in 5 games where a core buys a Midas, they never make their money back. For supports, that's 1 in 3 games they never make their money back. Of course, this is a much less significant problem if you're playing Ogre Magi, but you would be surprised by the number of games where even an Ogre Magi does not pay off their Midas debt. 1 in 5 cores sell their Midas before the game ends, and about 1 in 10 supports do. And this should be obvious, but a lot of players, even in reasonably high skill lobbies, are buying Midas after 20 minutes into the game. As the game goes past 20 minutes, Midas purchases are correlated with increasingly negative outcomes. Now you might be wondering, why did we split Ogre Magi out of some of the stats that we've been sharing? And the reason is Ogre Magi has a very different relationship to Hand of Midas from every other hero, and that's because of multicast. Because this video already has all of the appeal of an accounting seminar with all of the charisma of a shareholder update, I do not want to plop a bunch of screenshots from Microsoft Excel tables in front of you. But I just do not have 100 hours to put motion graphics together for this, so hopefully this is a nice middle ground. We're categorizing games by the net worth advantage just before buying Midas. Boxes at the top mean that the Midas buyer was very far ahead when they made the purchase. The bottom means the Midas buyer was very far behind when they made the purchase. Then the left and right directions are for the Midas buyer's entire team. Then the headline value in each box shows the win rate difference between players who bought Midas and those who did not, given these starting conditions. I'll flip through quickly and you can pause to see anything in more detail. There's also a link to this dashboard in the YouTube description. N is the total number of Midas games in each category, and a star means that the category was statistically significant with a p-value of at least 0.1. We do have this split up by role, mid, offlane, support, excluding Ogre Magi. For mid, I also have an invoker only section just because he builds Midas so often. And here's a section with just Ogre Magi. What you'll notice is that across all roles, buying a Midas without a significant lead generally accompanies a very significant loss in win expectancy, and that the penalty in Midas games can be very severe, up to about 40% decrease in wins. That's an extremely strong penalty for a decision made by a single player pretty early in the game. Okay, so we have a bunch of data, but what can we actually do with it? So we can take individual net worth advantage, team net worth advantage, time of the purchase of Midas, and the role the player who bought Midas was playing, and put them all into a mathematical relationship to predict when buying a Midas correlates with winning more games. In this dashboard, the percentages are the actual change in win rate that we saw from raw data. The label is the model's interpretation of whether Midas is a good idea. In this model, never means don't even consider it. Pass means it's rarely a good idea, and lean buy means it's probably a good idea. However, I tested this model on a new batch of games, and it tends to overestimate how good Midas is, especially later in the game. There's a much smaller sample size after about 15 minutes, so the regression is fitted on fewer sample games. That said, this model was tested, and it is more accurate at predicting outcomes than predictions based on net worths alone. I would just warn that lean pass probably actually means pass, and lean buy is far from a guarantee. The most common narrative about Midas is that it will help you catch up if your team had bad laning phase. But the data shows the opposite. Midas players have the most success if their team has a huge advantage at purchase time. The bigger, the better. And remember, this is predicting an increase in win rate over non-Midas buyers that had that same level of lead. I think that conceptually makes sense. A core who buys Midas usually does fuck all for at least 10 minutes after buying it, so their team really needs to have a big advantage to maintain control of the game long enough for the Midas to pay off. Now for supports, buying a semi-early Midas while your team is very far ahead, between say 12 and 18 minutes, can have double-digit impacts on win expectancy. But the downsides of buying Midas at the wrong time are even worse than for core players. This is a support decision that could single-handedly correlate with a drop of win expectancy that is over 20%. Even Ogre Magi really shouldn't be buying Midas if his team is struggling. And just to be thorough, I did download 312 Midas games that were not in the original dataset to test out our model. If the model couldn't perform on these games, then we would know that this was all a waste of our time. But the samples did follow the model predictions pretty closely. It is possible that many players who pick up Midas in losing situations are losing games because of some other factor they share in common, like a misunderstanding of the game. But because these are ranked games, and we generally expect a player to have a 50% chance to win in any given match, it's reasonable to assume that their losses are not inherent to them just being worse players and making worse decisions overall. If they were, they would have already lost rank until they were fairly matched. So the point is, if you become the sort of player who knows not to buy Midas in the majority of games, then you will win more. And if you know when to avoid Midas and when to target it, that is the first step for this understanding that will improve your gameplay. Before I wrap up here, I do want to point out that I talked about Invoker a lot here because he builds Midas more than any other hero. But he actually fares much better with Midas than other mids. So Outworld Destroyer builds Midas the third most, just after Invoker and Ogre Magi. And on average, that hero loses about 6% more games when buying Midas compared to when he does not buy Midas. Wow, that's a lot. So if you made it this deep into my screed, really thank you for watching the whole thing and being interested. I'm not sure if I'm going to make more videos like this, but if you have questions about it, drop them in the comments and let me know. I'm interested to hear what people think. I think this is the point in the video where I'm supposed to tell you to like and subscribe. I don't know if I'm going to have more videos up. But do tell me if there's questions that you would be interested in me answering using this dataset or a dataset on the new patch once I'm able to get it.